Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Maggie Neola. I am a dietitian at the Physicians Committee. Allow me to introduce Dr. Alan Desmond. Dr. Desmond is a gastroenterologist who's especially interested in the role of diet for Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis, a member of the Royal College of Physicians of Ireland and a fellow of the Royal College of Physicians of London. He has published influential research papers in the field of inflammatory bowel disease and has spoken at numerous medical conferences on the benefits of a whole food plant-based diet for the gut. Dr. Desmond, welcome.
So thank you everybody for joining me this afternoon. I hope everyone's had a chance to refresh and recharge after Marco's workout this morning. First time I've been to a medical conference where they made me do burpees before my presentation. So I'm going to remember that, Dr. Bernard, next time we host you here in the UK. So today I'll be talking to you about how 100 health professionals reduced their cardiovascular risk in 28 days. I'm Dr. Alan Desmond. I'm a consultant gastroenterologist and general physician here in the UK. And like many of you, I'd hoped to be in Washington, D.C. this week, but I'm so impressed by the effort that PCRM and the team at PCRM behind the scenes have put in to getting this conference off the ground and making it a success in these challenging times. I'm here as an ambassador for Plant-Based Health Professionals UK, pbhp.uk. Please visit our website. And today I'm going to be talking to you about something that we called the Southwest Plant-Based Diet Challenge. Now, if you saw my talk yesterday, you'll know that I am an advocate for a healthy whole food plant-based diet, particularly in treating patients with inflammatory bowel disease, but also to help patients achieve whole health. I've spoken at a lot of conferences, but I also speak at a lot of local meetings here in the southwest of England. Just before Christmas, I was invited to speak at two events. One event was for local GPs and senior family doctors in my area, and another was for senior GPs in the southwest of England. And I spoke to them about the sort of topics that we are quite used to hearing about at conferences like ICNM. So I spoke to them about the blue zones, these longevity hotspots around the world: California, Costa Rica, Italy, Greece, and Japan. I spoke to them about the evidence from Okinawa, Japan's blue zone, showing that these traditional living Okinawans had the longest disability-free life expectancy in the world, living 7 years longer than the average American, with 80% fewer cases of colorectal cancer and breast cancer, 1/6 the rate of heart disease, and 5 times as many centenarians. And I told them about the Okinawa longevity diet as published in the Annals of the Academy of Sciences all the way back in 2007. Not suggesting that everybody needs to live on a diet of sweet potatoes, but just demonstrating that this is a whole food and 96 to 98% plant-based diet. I showed them a traditional Okinawan meal: tofu, miso, and vegetables, 50 ingredients, 550 calories per serving, high in fiber, not calorie dense, but nutrient dense. And I told them how different this was to a standard British meal. I had no problem showing this as a standard British meal, given that we've been eating like this in this part of the world since 1973, and 1 in 5 UK adults get 80% of their calories from these highly processed, ultra-processed junk foods. Of course, we also talked about Loma Linda, the US blue zone, where individuals have 28% fewer cases of breast cancer, 35% fewer cases of digestive cancer, less heart disease, less stroke, and 65% less type 2 diabetes than their neighbors. And again, why? What were they eating? I explained, as many of you already know, that the Seventh-day Adventists of Loma Linda follow this biblical verse: I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food, with the result that half are vegetarian and 1 in 12 eat a completely plant-based diet. And even those who consume meat and dairy consume it in much lower amounts than most Americans or British people. I also showed them this data, which you're very familiar with. Of course, we had the amazing Dr. Fraser presenting yesterday, the author of this paper and so many other papers, showing that even among the healthy Seventh-day Adventists, as we take the animal products out, moving from non-vegetarian to semi-vegetarian to pesco-vegetarian to lacto-ovo-vegetarian and finally to vegan, we see the rates of obesity and type 2 diabetes coming down in a stepwise fashion. And I showed them this traditional plant-based Seventh-day Adventist style dish. It's not exactly similar to the Okinawan dish I showed earlier, but it has so much in common with it. A diversity of plants, high in fiber, high in complex carbohydrates, low in calorie density, but high in nutrient density. And again, drawing a comparison, a typical UK meal, a traditional British meal, the full cooked breakfast made up of eggs, processed meat, and refined flour. Here in a country where the average person consumes 200 eggs and 25.5 kilograms of red and processed meat and 83 kilograms of meat per year. We also talked about the Eat Lancet Commission report. As you know, the Lancet, one of the world's leading medical journals, every now and then they ask an independent panel of experts to answer some difficult questions. When they asked them to answer the question, how should we eat? They described a plate that looks just like a Blue Zone plate, half fruits and vegetables, prioritizing whole grains, plant protein sources, unsaturated plant oils, and optionally, just optionally, very, very modest amounts of animal protein. The Lancet Commission very helpfully provided this diagram, which gives us an indication of how current American intakes compare to what they described as the safe level of consumption, showed by this dotted line. The fruits, vegetables, whole grains, nuts and seeds are barely visible. And I showed them data from the UK Burden of Disease Study 2010, telling us that the UK does not perform well in terms of premature mortality and disease. And when we look at the top 10 drivers of poor health in the UK, we find that 10 of the top 20 are directly related to the foods that we choose to eat. In the UK, dietary factors alone account for more disease and disability than alcohol and drug use combined. Now, this all made my colleagues feel a little bit pessimistic, but in fact, this was a message of hope because we can do things to change it. I told them about Dr. Kim Williams' statement 5 years ago. We heard from Dr. Kim Williams yesterday in an absolute tour de force. And I shared with them Dr. Esselstyn's work showing how we can prevent, halt, and maybe even reverse heart disease with a whole food plant-based diet. I also shared with them the good news that the American Cardiology, the American College of Cardiology and the American Heart Association Task Force on Clinical Practice Guidelines recommend plant-based and Mediterranean, so varied whole food plant-based diets to be the best diet to prevent heart disease, and how the official US guidelines, where 1 in 10 Americans have type 2 diabetes compared to 1 in 13 adults here in the UK, that the #1 dietary recommendation, all patients should strive to attain and maintain an optimal weight through a primarily plant-based meal plan. Now, we have seen all this evidence before. Some of the people who wrote these papers are presenting at the conference this weekend. But the idea that one can prevent, arrest, and even halt chronic disease with food was new to so many of my colleagues. They hadn't seen these papers before, and they were a little bit skeptical. And with thanks to my friends Stephen and David Flynn of the Happy Pair, successful restaurateurs and chefs and writers, but also online educators, we were able to challenge them to experience the benefits of a whole food plant-based diet for themselves by joining what we called the Southwest Plant-Based Diet Challenge. Over 150 health professionals took part. 50% of those taking part were family physicians, but we also had nurses and physios and dietitians and all the frontline staff that worked at their practices taking part. These are models. They didn't look like this. They look like this. This was Southwest England on the beach in January. And here are some of the challengers meeting for the first time just to launch the event. Food choices heading into the challenge. Well, here we are in the southwest of England. As we might expect, people were eating, that these health professionals were eating was a slightly healthier version of the standard Western diet. 81% omnivores, 67% consuming processed meat, only 5% of people eating a completely plant-based diet, and the average age was 49 years. After all, we are in the home of clotted cream. If you don't know what clotted cream is, you can search for it on Google. It's a specialty around these parts, and I think it's very aptly named, clotted cream. What did we ask them to do? We asked them to eat a whole food plant-based diet with no added oils, beans, greens, fruits, vegetables, nuts, and whole grains for 4 weeks. Eat as much as you like. No calorie counting. Mexican black beans, pan-fried mushrooms with spinach, pan-fried tofu with steamed greens and quinoa, spaghetti bolognese. Completely in keeping with the current guidelines for a healthy diet here in the UK. This is the NHS Eat Well plate, Public Health England Eat Well plate. The vast majority of foods on here are whole foods of plant origin, and the official guidelines recommend that we eat more beans and pulses, putting plant-based sources of protein ahead of animal-based. Of course, also completely in keeping with the Canadian Healthy Eating Guidelines, which ask us to eat lots of fruits and vegetables, prioritize plants as our source of protein. And if we're thirsty, don't drink milk, drink water. And of course, completely in keeping with the PCRM Power Plate. This was a community event. We were delighted to have the support of local restaurants. A lot of local businesses put on challenge-friendly menus, so we could have lunchtime get-togethers and breakfast get-togethers with challengers to support them in taking on this challenge. At our local small hospital, we had a weekly bring and share where health professionals could bring their lovely plant-based recipes and share them and enjoy them and have these wonderful events. For those who couldn't make it in person and more relevant now in the time of COVID, we also had a private Facebook group, and it was such a joy to see my previously omnivorous GP colleagues suddenly sharing pictures of their wonderful plant-based meals. During the challenge, thank you to Stephen and David Flynn, we were able to provide online videos and content basically teaching my colleagues how to eat and enjoy healthy, whole food, plant-based dishes. Talking about alternatives to dairy, how to read labels, how to buy produce, even teaching them knife skills so they could chop their vegetables efficiently. And again, we took the opportunity to introduce my colleagues for the first time in many cases to heroes like Nathan Pritikin, Dr. Esselstyn, Dr. Greger, and Dr. Ornish. What we were doing was replicating work that's already been done. We talked a lot on the course about the BROAD study, which, as you know, is a randomized controlled trial using a whole food plant-based diet in the community for obesity, ischemic heart disease, and diabetes, published 3 years ago now in March 2017. This was a 3-month educational program for individuals who were overweight or obese, who also had type 2 diabetes, heart disease, or high cholesterol, randomizing them to either standard of care or a standard of care plus a plant-based dietary intervention. And after 6 months, the plant-based diet group had improved. They'd lost weight. They'd reduced their cholesterol. They'd improved their glycemic control. And they'd done all of this whilst using fewer medications, a 30% reduction in prescribed medications. However, the standard of care group had done exactly what we sadly expect patients to do when they receive standard of care in many cases. They'd not lost weight, they'd gained weight. They hadn't reduced their cholesterol, and all this despite using 8% more prescribed medications. And of course, I also told them about this study published by Dr. Bernard and the team, published I think 2 years ago now, 75 adults with a raised BMI who were not yet known to have type 2 diabetes, heart disease, or hypercholesterolemia. And again, 16 weeks, eat as much food as you like, whole food, plant-based, just a 1-hour group meeting per week. And what happened? They lost weight, they lost fat mass, and they improved their insulin sensitivity. And the more whole carbs they consumed, the better. So back to our challengers, 57 of our challengers logged their blood pressure, their weight, and their lipid profiles. So they were a relatively healthy bunch, healthcare professionals, nobody with type 2 diabetes, no smokers. Only 2 challengers who were taking statin medication. Let's talk about what happened to their blood pressure first. These are the US American Heart Association categories for hypertension. Worth noting that uncontrolled high blood pressure significantly increases one's risk of heart heart attack, stroke, heart failure, and other life-threatening illnesses. Incredibly, nearly half of all US adults have high blood pressure, and fewer than half of those have their blood pressure under control. This is what the blood pressure in our group looked like as we began. According to the AHA guidelines, 37% of the group had a completely normal blood pressure with a systolic less than 120. Keep an eye on the green wedge, because after 4 weeks of a plant-based diet, that green wedge had increased in size. 58% of challengers now had a completely healthy blood pressure, and challengers with stage 1 or stage 2 hypertension had seen a mean systolic drop of 13 millimeters of mercury, equal to or better than one would expect to see with prescribed medications. Let's have a look at body weight. Sadly, 64% of UK adults are overweight or obese. Among our challenge population, they were doing quite well, a relatively healthy population. Only 37% were overweight in yellow or obese, shown in red. The heavier they were, or the higher their BMI, the more weight they lost. Those who were obese or overweight lost an average of 10.8 to 11 pounds. Even those with a healthy BMI lost a little bit of weight. There was nobody involved in the challenge who was underweight to begin with. And again, let's see what effect that had. Keep an eye on the green box, because the green box got a lot bigger, because in 4 weeks, just 28 days, the prevalence of overweight and obesity in our challengers went from 37% to 27%. Let's talk about cholesterol. Just a little refresher for anybody who needs it. Cholesterol, essential to human health, but our body makes all that we need. The bad atherogenic cholesterol is the cholesterol that's being transported out into our body in the forms of VLDL and LDL. It's supposed to go to the cells where it's needed for important biological functions. And HDL is the good cholesterol, the cholesterol that brings the excess cholesterol back to our liver, where it's converted into bile salts and excreted in our gastrointestinal tract. So we're going to talk about the atherogenic, the bad non-HDL stuff over on the left-hand side. So in the UK, non-HDL of less than 4 is regarded as normal or target. Heading into the challenge, 1/3 of our group had an elevated baseline non-HDL, and they are shown in yellow and red. Over 4 weeks on plants, we saw reductions. The average reduction in non-HDL was 26.5%. And again, the higher your starting number, the greater the benefit. In just 4 weeks, those with a significantly elevated non-HDL saw a reduction in 30%. What did that do to how the population appeared? Well, again, please keep an eye on the green box, because after 28 days, 94% of these health professionals had a normal non-HDL cholesterol. In fact, 71% had achieved a optimal target non-HDL of less than 130 milligrams per deciliter. So what had we done to their cardiovascular risk? We know from this meta-analysis that if we use a statin medication to reduce your cholesterol, your non-HDL, by 26.5%, as we did without statins, that we are reducing your risk of having coronary heart disease within the next 4.5 years by 26%. This graph shows your non-HDL cholesterol versus your risk of having ischemic heart disease or developing ischemic heart disease. For our challengers with an elevated non-HDL to start with, they were right here on the graph with a significantly elevated risk. Just 4 weeks on a whole food plant-based diet, and we were able to bring them right down to here. In fact, as I pointed out earlier, 71% of all challengers finished with a non-HDL of less than 130 milligrams per deciliter. So what had we achieved in 28 days? We had reversed hypertension, dropping the systolic by 13.7 in patients with in challengers with hypertension. We'd seen an average weight loss of 3.2 kilograms, maximum of 9.5 kilograms. The more overweight individuals were, the higher their BMI, the more weight they lost. With those with an elevated and atherogenic cholesterol, we saw an average reduction of 26.5%. And the epidemiological data would suggest that we had significantly reduced our risk of heart disease and cardiovascular disease. The feedback from my colleagues was incredible. I lost 6 kilograms and 40% reduction in my non-HDL. My digestion is much better and no bloating, feeling lighter and more alive. I felt better on the diet with my bowels and I didn't miss dairy at all. Surprised me as a lifelong dairy addict. Generally felt better, loved the food on the challenge. May relax criteria a little, that's okay, we weren't judging anybody. But luckily this person's family was in agreement. More energy, happier, lighter, working out, doing more yoga, making healthy changes. General health has improved sleep, better mood, no migraines, just fantastic. Improved blood sugar control, as we would expect to see, more energy, better relationship with food. Just remember, folks, these are healthcare professionals, carnivorous healthcare professionals who are experiencing this for the first time. We asked challengers to set their own objectives for the 4 weeks, and almost 90% of them felt that they'd met those objectives. And we saw some significant behavior change. At the start of the challenge, I showed you this earlier, food choices, 67% consuming processed meat, 72% consuming red meat, and predominantly an omnivorous population. After 4 weeks, we'd seen some significant changes in food behavior. 21% made the decision to remain on a completely plant-based diet, and the remainder made significant steps towards that. 98% of challengers no longer consuming bacon and sausage and processed meat. 91% no longer consuming red meat, 74% no longer consuming poultry. Why? Because they'd seen the benefits. So now we have a population made up of those who are completely plant-based, those who are vegetarian, and those who are flexitarian. So in many ways, we moved our challengers firmly towards a UK blue zone diet. We asked all challengers if we should make a similar program available to our patients. The resounding answer was yes, from 97%. And we started making moves towards that, but unfortunately, just like everything else, we hit a little bit of a stall due to the tragic global pandemic of COVID-19, which as of this morning has claimed 715,163 deaths worldwide. Incredible. Data coming out of China very early warned us that patients with heart disease, diabetes, and high blood pressure had significant increased chances of dying once they were affected by COVID-19. As the pandemic spread to New York, when New York became the epicenter of the epicenter, we saw the same picture. 86.2% of the state's deaths involved at least one major comorbidity. What are these comorbidities? Things which we regard as almost inevitable in high-income countries, but as we know, these things can be prevented and reversed. Hypertension, type 2 diabetes, hyperlipidemia, and coronary artery disease being the 4 main comorbidities. Same data here in the UK. This paper published in the BMJ just 2 months ago, looking at admissions to hospital between February and April of 2020, when more than 60,000 individuals were hospitalized with COVID-19. 1 in 4 sadly died, 1 in 6 ended up in the intensive care unit, and 77% had underlying chronic diseases. This very much reflects my own experience. Like many physicians this spring, I gave up my specialty and my ward, my gastroenterology unit, became a COVID-19 unit. Many of the patients that I treated, those who I palliated sadly, were older folks and folks with multiple preventable comorbidities, including obesity. This data published in the BMG shows that regardless of age, comorbidity, social deprivation, or ethnicity, obesity remains an independent predictor of poor outcome. In the UK, if you are hospitalized with COVID-19 and your body mass index is greater than 40, you are twice as likely to die, to not survive the illness. And unfortunately, 29% of UK adults have a BMI of greater than 40 and are classified as morbidly obese. But of course, I don't want to finish by leaving you all feeling pessimistic. I want to finish with a note of optimism. right now, as we fight this pandemic, the world's governments and healthcare providers have firmly focused on improving the underlying health of the general populations. It's 5 p.m. right here in the UK, and I've spent my day in Zoom meetings speaking to NHS professionals, looking at ways that we can use the information that we know about a whole food plant-based diet to improve the health of our population and to prepare them for what we think will be an inevitable second wave. Thank you very much for listening to this presentation. Thank you, PCRM, for inviting me and making this conference happen. Again, in my ambassador role, please visit the homepage of Plant-Based Health Professionals UK. If you'd like to contact me, my email address is on screen, or you can find me on Instagram at Dr. Alan Desmond. And thank you for watching, and thank you, Maggie.
Thank you, Dr. Desmond. What a fantastic, inspirational presentation. It's very cool to see all the success that you had with your challenge, and to see with the pandemic disrupting that for your patients. But anyway, let's get started with a few questions from the audience. The first question that we have come in is, how did you get the restaurants to offer food with no oil or salt or sugar? How did you go about doing that and developing that partnership?
Well, one of the useful things, Maggie, was that I live smack bang in the heart of the area where this challenge was performed. I'm a regular at most of these restaurants, and they all already provided plant-based meals because that's what consumers want now. Consumers want healthy, whole food, plant-based meals on the menu, even when they visit a restaurant or facility that isn't labeled plant-based, vegetarian, or vegan. So consumer demand means that restaurants need to adapt to these things. But yes, I did go and visit the individual restaurants and recruit them and explain the challenge to them individually. And, you know, there's no substitute for turning up on someone's doorstep in a small local business and saying, we're doing this thing. Can you be part of it? So it was just by knocking on doors, Maggie.
Wow, that's fantastic. You're definitely a role model. Were there other clinicians or staff that were helping you put on this challenge? Like, what's realistic for someone who wants to do this in their medical center? How can they do this practically? How much help do they need in order to pull it off?
What I always advocate, Maggie, is to my colleagues and friends and connections in this world that whatever your role, if you're a teacher, a doctor, a dietitian, or whatever, even if you're not in a healthcare role, if you're working within any sort of organization, if you recognize the benefits of a whole food plant-based diet, don't be afraid. Tell people about it. If you work at a hospital and there's a grand rounds, they're always looking for someone to present. So just volunteer, go ahead and just enthusiastically speak about this. Now, thanks to many years of enthusiastically speaking about this, I had numerous colleagues who were willing to help. And in fact, this couldn't have happened without the support of a GP colleague such as Dr. Jenny Corser, dietitian colleagues like Sarah Jones and Deborah Howland, and colleagues within the local voluntary sector such as Chloe Myers. So without the support of that team, this just wouldn't have happened.
Mm-hmm. I'm really glad you had a good team with you. So that's awesome. In terms of the people who, you advertised it to your different colleagues, did you get any pushback from some of the providers to your original invitation to join the challenge, and who didn't end up joining you?
Well, a few of the challengers were quite skeptical.
Mm-hmm.
But I did go back a few weeks later and present the data to them, and they were very impressed by the outcome. I really wanted to launch this challenge in a very open and inviting and non-judgmental way. So if there was some pushback, I just responded to that with positivity. And in fact, while we asked volunteers who were taking on the challenge to check their blood pressure and weight and cholesterol profiles, and of course these are all healthcare professionals working at GP practices, so they were able to do that. That was completely voluntary. In fact, anybody who had heard about the challenge was welcome to join, even without checking their parameters. So we just tried to keep it very open, very inviting, very non-judgmental. We gave people the tools. We didn't go around to their houses and look in the refrigerators. but we gave them the tools to improve their health. So if there was any pushback, it didn't feel insurmountable.
Well, you're very positive, so I know that that helps a lot. I'm sure the rest of your team is as well. Do you think that the people who attended this challenge are getting the word out to other healthcare professionals and other medical centers? What have you seen since then?
Very much so. In my day job as a busy consultant gastroenterologist, I have a lot of contact with GP colleagues and healthcare providers in our local, what we call a primary care network, which covers a population of tens of thousands of individuals. And we had professionals throughout the southwest of England taking part in this. Although I'd invited people at these two conferences, the word went out actually. So it was very much a word of mouth success here. So yeah, right now, I mean, it's quite common for me to take a phone call from a GP who has some complex issue that they're trying to solve with a complex gastrointestinal issue for one of their patients. And the conversations often end, oh, by the way, Dr. Desmond, I did the Southwest Plant-Based Diet Challenge and we can't wait to hear more about it. So it's been, in many ways, I felt like we've been pushing on an open door.
Wow, that's fantastic. It's really cool to see positive responses and, see the UK leading the way. Definitely really great to see that. The clotted butter made me laugh quite a bit.
Clotted cream. Very apt name, I think. Clotted cream.
Very apt. I agree with you on that one. Another question is, was there a standardized tool you used to assess pre and post program diet?
We didn't actually. So this, as you probably gathered, although we produced some pretty powerful information, this wasn't a clinical trial. This wasn't a clinical study. It was a voluntary effort. We had no budget to run this. We were very delighted that my friends Stephen and David Flynn gave us a gift of free access to one of their online courses called the Happy Heart course, which is pure, as I say to people, it's pure Bernard, pure Esselstyn, pure Ornish, pure Pritikin. It's healthy, whole food, plant-based education program. But they were very kindly produced a bespoke version of that course, Southwest Plant-Based Diet Challenge, complete with branding and everything, free of cost. So we had no costs associated with this. But as we move forward and bring this to our patients, it's become extremely urgent, Maggie, that we do this in the time of COVID. As we move forward, we will be collecting and using standardized tools to very much improve the quality of the data that we collect, because we don't just want to do this in our local area. We want to do it right, and we want to create more data that we can share with other NHS primary care networks here in the UK.
I hadn't heard of the Happy Pair before. Are there resources available nationally, or is it mostly just for the UK? It looks like they have virtual resources, so I'm assuming it's a...
Yeah, Steve and Dave are friends of mine from back in Ireland. They are healthy, whole food, plant-based chefs. They've been eating like this for 20 years. They've got, look, just type Happy Pair into YouTube. They've got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of lovely recipes up there, identical twin brothers. They are poster boys for living your best life on a whole food plant-based diet. And they've featured on a few documentaries on Netflix, etc. So they have an international presence, but I guess they're mostly famous in Ireland and the UK.
Well, I can't wait to tell my patients about them, and I'm sure many people listening will be doing that as well. So that's awesome. Another question was, what sorts of problems or questions did your participants raise as they went through the program? And was there any kind of coaching to help them along?
Yes, so we provided access to this private Facebook group, and we would do live Q&As there at least once a week. And we used those as an opportunity because, again, our audience were healthcare professionals. And obviously, my secret ulterior motive was to educate my colleagues about the benefits of a plant-based diet in a fun and engaging way. So yes, we had live Q&As in the Facebook group every single week, several occasions. I was in there from the medical perspective. Steve and Dave were in there from the dietary perspective. And, you know, Maggie, it was the usual questions, you know, where am I getting my protein? What about calcium? What about vitamin B12? And, you know, we have the evidence. I mean, as my friend Brenda Davis says, we know enough. We truly know enough to make a whole food plant-based diet and lifestyle our #1 recommendation for the treatment and prevention of so many chronic diseases. So the awesome thing is the evidence is there. So when my colleagues challenged me, I could show them the papers, I could show them the information, because this was a very educated target audience that we were dealing with. But yeah, it speaks for itself, right?
Yeah. Well, knowing your target audience, that's great. What resources or tools do you think were most effective for them in particular?
Honestly, I think the community support. The community support, because it's one thing to sit down and watch an engaging video where someone tells you about the benefits of a plant-based diet and show you the statistics that I just showed you, blood pressure coming down, cholesterol, weight, etc., all improving. It's one thing to open a recipe book and look at some beautiful recipes, but when your friends and your colleagues are doing this, or if you're a member of a virtual community where everybody is doing this and where your neighbors are sharing photographs and tips as to where's the best place to buy quinoa in the southwest of England, what's the correct way to pronounce quinoa. You know, that's what makes it achievable. It's about community support. And of course, I know at PCRM that you will, when you're doing a dietary intervention, you run groups, right? So you've got to normalize this change. We looked at a few pictures of standard British meals. No surprise that there is no blue zone right here in the UK, right? Yeah. But we're trying to build one, maybe. And if you're in a country where everybody's eating like that and suddenly you're eating like this, you need to surround yourself with people either in person or virtually who are doing the same thing.
Yeah, yeah. Well, speaking of like making it easier to help everybody feel that there's this trend and community support, one of the attendees here asked, they said that they saw that the UK has launched a campaign to combat obesity, and they're wondering if the government officials have reacted to that call to promote whole food plant-based diet to prevent and reverse underlying conditions and obesity, of course, which is included in that.
Yes, well, I think nationally the recommendations that have come out in terms of reducing obesity in the UK are a little bit old-fashioned, you know, about not advertising junk foods before 9 p.m. and, you know, just this sort of not a very positive way. In fact, the Prime Minister described it as a war on obesity, which is not the positive messaging that you really want to use if you're going to get results. So a little bit disappointing, I think, but there is a huge ability for us as healthcare professionals and leaders within our own communities to seize this opportunity to show that this stuff works, a whole food plant-based diet works, so why don't we implement it in our community and lead by example? And that's what we're hoping to do. As I said, I've spent my day in other Zoom meetings discussing exactly that.
Oh, great. Yeah, that's fantastic. So tell me again, when did this challenge end? What was the date that it
It ended on Valentine's Day, 14th of February. Yeah,
wow.
So we all got together and had a Valentine's Day breakfast to celebrate the end. And of course, it was only just a few weeks after that that the pandemic really took grip and the UK went into lockdown.
Yeah, that is tricky. Do you think that those who did the challenge have been able to maintain that change? I don't know if you've been able to check in with them since then.
So we haven't formally assessed. So I can't answer that question honestly. But really we performed this challenge as a springboard to the next challenge. And really the pandemic has created a renewed sense of urgency. And we already have the enthusiasm, and by involving so many local healthcare professionals, we've really created champions in every doctor's office in the region. So it's been a really good experience.
Yeah, that ripple effect is, I'm sure, happening. So with all that enthusiasm you saw for bringing this to patients, what are your next steps and plans for this? How do you want to continue to reach not just clinicians, but also patients?
Yes, well, we're hoping to run a pilot study. I mean, the implementation of a whole food plant-based diet, I mean, we've seen dozens of papers over decades, right, going all the way back to Dr. Nathan Pritikin, Dr. Hans Deal's work in the mid-90s when I was halfway through medical school, Dr. Bernard's papers, Dr. Ornish's papers, Dr. Esselstyn's papers. But I think for the UK to really embrace this, we're going to have to see some local data we're going to have to show how well this can work here in the UK. The Southwest Plant-Based Diet Challenge has provided some of that in a slightly informal way, but some pretty compelling results. So I think our next step, Maggie, is going to implement a similar program for our local patients, and hopefully we'll be running a formal pilot project involving maybe 50 or 100 patients ASAP, because there's a great sense of urgency now. And if we can then share that data, and just like many US health systems, I mean, as you know, here in the UK, we have the NHS. The service is free to all users. There is no cost associated with healthcare. But perhaps even more importantly, that means that the cost of delivering healthcare is extremely important to the NHS. And what we can leverage here is that we can spend relatively small amounts of money and get a return on that investment and save money in the long term and reduce medication use and reduce hospital admissions just by getting people to eat more beans, greens, whole grains, fruits, vegetables, nuts, and seeds.
Really that simple. Yeah, it's great to be able to show those outcomes. So I'm glad that you're trying to collect that data. So we have a special request from one of our attendees wondering if you'd be willing to do an online challenge for US providers as well.
Oh, we should do. We should do. I mean, this is it. I mean, really, it's a great idea. You get more champions. And like I said earlier, if you can get health professionals, sadly, there are so many health professionals who've never seen these slides. Early on in my presentation today, I shared with you slides showing, for example, Dr. Esselstyn's publication from 2014. Now, I was a little bit embarrassed showing that at this conference because almost everybody has seen those slides, right? But there's so many people out there, particularly health professionals, who have never seen this data.
Right.
And there's so many reasons for that, but we need to overcome that and present it and demonstrate it at every opportunity.
Yeah, and it's sometimes, I mean, I can say this for myself, it's good to see some of the same things twice, multiple times, and then
absolutely
be able to tell other people about it the more that you learn and verbalize it to them. So that's great. I personally have a question too, in terms of with your field of gastroenterology. Do you see more and more gastroenterologists really approaching plant-based nutrition and seeing the benefits of all the different fiber that's part of this diet? What is that looking like in terms of your field and awareness of nutrition's role?
No, very much so. As I said yesterday in my presentation on inflammatory bowel disease, specifically Crohn's disease, the benefits of a whole food plant-based diet are certainly entering the mainstream in the world of gastroenterology. In fact, I had a message this morning from a patient with ulcerative colitis. And she just sent me a message to say that she had a wonderful GI physician treating her in Australia for her ulcerative colitis who took care of her really, really well, but had never once asked her about the food that she consumes, which is very, very typical, okay? So a few weeks ago, she saw her GI, things weren't going very well. There was a question of increasing her medication. She made the switch to a whole food plant-based diet. She came back to see her GI for her next appointment. Her inflammatory markers were down. Both she and her GI were extremely pleased with her progress, delighted with her progress, in fact. The decision being that she does not need to increase her medication. She told her GI about the information that she'd read from me. She told her GI why she'd adopted a whole food plant-based diet, and her GI's response to her was fantastic. There is so much evidence to support that. So this is a GI who doesn't talk to their patients about food, but who is reading the medical literature, and the term plant-based, high fiber, low fat, etc., is entering the parlance within the gastroenterology world. We saw a paper just published a few weeks ago showing how patients with ulcerative colitis benefited from a healthy dietary intervention. And the title of that paper, patients with ulcerative colitis treated with a low-fat, high-fiber diet, improve dysbiosis, improve quality of life, and reduce inflammatory markers. That was published in CGH, which is one of our leading journals in the field of gastroenterology. So it's certainly entering the mainstream.
That is so encouraging to hear that in those journals. What about with medical schools? Do you see the curriculum having any kind of plant-based nutrition or even nutrition at all included in that?
Well, I think like a lot of advocates for a healthy whole food plant-based diet, I will speak anytime I'm invited. So I've spoken at a number of medical schools. In the UK, there's a medical student group called NutriTank who are campaigning to have more practical nutrition brought into their medical curriculum.
Mm.
And there have been certainly moves in that direction, but it's slow.
Yeah, well, NutriTink, that's a very clever name. I hope that they're very successful. That's fantastic. Well, I just want to appreciate you and thank you for your time sharing this fantastic challenge that you did. I know I feel inspired, and I really hope that our attendees will want to do the same with their colleagues and patients. So thank you again, Dr. Desmond, for such a wonderful presentation. We'll end a few minutes early and allow people to have a stretch break. So
Okay, thanks, Maggie. I appreciate it. Thank you, everybody.
you're welcome. Take care.